The spread of the novel coronavirus has created fear around the world, and the global market is feeling the shock. Last month, the U.S. stock market experienced one of its darkest moments since 2008. The Chinese economy is also affected, and the government has implemented measures to help businesses endure the hardship. So, will demand in China be revitalized soon? How are Japan and European countries handling the pressure? And what new challenges are coming for the global market? To discuss these and more, I'm joined by Ian Beck, professional research fellow from the London School of Economics and Political Science, Takuji Okubu, director of the Economist Corporate Network for North Asia, and Professor Jun Qian from Fanhai International School of Finance at Fudan University. That is our topic. This is Dialogue. I'm Zhou Yue. Let's talk about the global economic impact of this novel coronavirus epidemic. We have seen more than trillions of dollars worth of market value shed because of the coronavirus fear last week. So some people suspect that the world economy will come to a standstill. What is your take, Mr. Beck?
Well, I think that's probably correct. The coronavirus acts a bit like a crisis in the financial markets. It slows down the economy, it stops the usual exchange, and therefore the probability is that this will lead to a slowdown. Whether it means full-blown recession or is a blip because of the way things are going is uncertain at the moment. We just don't know whether the virus is going to be contained, whether it will fade away when the weather gets warmer in the northern hemisphere. These are the unknowns in it. But the best guess would be that it causes a mild recession, provided it doesn't get worse.
Can you explain to us why the world economy has suffered that much? Is there any overreaction from the market because people still need to buy and people still need to live?
Well, there are two things going on simultaneously. There's one, the disruption of production, what you might call a supply-side shock, where components may be slowed down. There is a shortage of demand in some areas because people are not buying the things they might otherwise buy. If you think, for example, of the tourism sector or the aviation sector, even a lot of retailing, people are hesitating to go out, they're hesitating to take trips, they don't want to go on holiday because the fear of the virus. Now, these are all things that slow down demand from the effects of the virus. It's the interconnections between the parts of the global economy that would cause that to spread. Otherwise, it would be a localized phenomenon in Wuhan and the adjoining province.
And also, Mr. Okubu, of course, Japan is also a big Asian economic power and neighbor of China. How much does the Japanese economy suffer because of the coronavirus outbreak?
Okay, so far, well, as Professor Begg mentioned, there's still too much uncertainties, but at our forecast, we've been revising down Japanese GDP growth, so we're actually looking at zero, nearly, virtually zero growth for Japanese economy. So it's definitely affecting Japan and potentially tipping Japan into a more severe recession.
And the most recent news is, of course, the oil market has plummeted. Some people say it's because of the price wars between Saudi Arabia and Russia, but others say it is because of the coronavirus uncertainties. What do you think are the main reasons driving down the price of oil, Mr. Buku?
Right. So I think for today's price action is concerned, I think it has more to do with a decision made by Saudi Arabia and Russia. So it has less to do with coronavirus. But having said that, knowing financial market traders, they tend to, catch on like news of the day to actually to make a trade they've been feeling they need to do for many days. So I think in the background, of course, there's a possibility, there's a risk that in the long term, there's much less demand for energy.
So you agree, Mr. Beck, this is because of the world is looking at a possible drawing down of demand. That's what is driving the oil prices down, and it will probably stay this level for quite some time.
I think there's an effect from the slowdown in the global economy to the oil price. Whether it stays for a long time is an entirely different question, because if the coronavirus largely fades away, then you'd expect to have a return to business as usual, in which case the oil price relationship to GDP would restore itself to its normal relationships. However, if we're also seeing, as seems to be the evidence, a price war between Russia and Saudi Arabia, plus the fact that many parts of the world are shifting rapidly towards greening of the economy, then it's less good news for oil, but it's good news for the rest of us who consume oil and use oil as an input into many manufactured products. So nothing is ever that simple when you have these global interconnections.
But what will be the financial ramifications if oil prices are fluctuated like that?
Well, the financial ramifications is a lowering of inflation, because oil is a component in prices. It's going to be bad news for major oil producers because they get less for their barrel of oil, but good news for the rest of us.
And also, Mr. Okubu, you agree this might be good news for some and bad news for the others?
Yes, I would say that. Obviously, there are other energy producers such as shale in the U.S., but I think for the world as a whole, actually, lower oil price is actually, it's not necessarily a bad thing. But then having said that, I do think so long as we assume that this coronavirus is a relatively a kind of temporary phenomenon, I mean, in a sense, like maybe it lasts for half a year or a year. So if you are like a long-term user of energy, including oil, I think, and then if you want to have some plan for the next 10 years, it might be actually a good, buying opportunity.
I'd like to talk a little about Japan's relations with China. Obviously, Japan could be at a particular risk because it relies on tourism revenue from China, and now it seems tourists from China are very reluctant to go to Japan as tourists. How much of a blow it will be to the Japanese economy and the Abenomics that we're being so proud of because of its effects on the economy?
Okay, so obviously inbound tourism has been, there has been a lot of focus on inbound tourism. I mean, not just from Chinese, but also, Koreans, Vietnamese, Philippines, Thai. So this has, as you mentioned, this has been one of the, poster child for Abenomics or Japan's growth. Having said that, it's actually inbound tourism only account for 20% of whole tourism. So whole inbound tourism, it's about 5 trillion yen, actually less than 5 trillion yen. So if there's going to be like a zero tourists from China, I mean, it's just a 0.2, 0.3% of GDP. I think for bigger problem for Japan is basically if the consumer confidence is hit severely, I think that could actually cause a recession.
And do you think the consumer's confidence will suffer greatly because people are less willing to buy and travel?
Yes, indeed. So I'm sure in the next coming weeks and months, we are seeing pretty bad numbers when it comes to retail sales. However, I think as I look at whatever number is available, Japanese consumer confidence is actually less affected as of now than in elsewhere. So I think with more aggressive fiscal policy stimulus, maybe monetary policy, there is still a room for Japanese government to maintain or reduce the damage to the consumer confidence.
And also, a lot of people think that Prime Minister Abe want to capitalize on the Summer Olympics to draw in revenue for Japan, and that is hanging in the balance right now. To what extent it will affect Japanese economic expectation?
Yeah, so I think Olympic has sort of a symbolic value to Prime Minister Abe and to Japanese economy in general. But I think, if you have to decide now whether to cancel Olympic or not now, I think you would feel it's more prudent to cancel it now. But the good news for Japan and Prime Minister Abe is that it doesn't have to be now. International Olympic Committee is saying maybe early May would be a period when they need to decide. So I think what Japanese government to do is do their best to keep it for the next 2 months and just leave it to the International Committee to decide.
Yeah, work for the best and prepare for the worst. And now we have Professor Chen Jun join us from Fudan University. Professor Chen, China's trade dropped sharply in January and February, according to the Customs Authority. Exports in January, February actually slumped 17% to $290 billion. That's a very sharp drop, even for China as a big trader. Could this fallout cripple China's economic growth?
Right, so the export did drop quite a bit. I should point out that import actually only dropped 4 to 5%. That's one. And two, as we've been discussing, it's very important to realize that the impact of the virus on the economy is temporary. Now, we don't know whether that's going to be, given the global situation, we don't know if that's going to end in May or June, but nevertheless, it's temporary.
Why do you say it's temporary? Some say, well, probably linger for a year or more.
Investors to realize. So, if you look at the numbers, if you look at what China has been doing, it's pretty much under control in China. If you look at outside China, I noticed that numbers in Korea have actually improved quite a bit. In Italy, it looks very bad, but if they do these measures, take these tough measures, I think in 2 weeks you'll see improvement. So I'm very certain that this is going to be temporary. And if that's the basis for the arguments, then everything, economic activities, trade, will come back. In fact, just to make a relevant point, I was on my way here. The last few times it takes like 15 minutes. Today the traffic was very bad. So actually, at this particular juncture, that's encouraging. So we do see that all kinds of economic activities in China are resuming. Certainly not to the full scale, but I'm hopeful that maybe by the end of March, something like, outside of Hubei, something like 80% of the firms maybe will recover 80% of their business. And if that's the case, going forward, we will see similar recoveries in other countries. It's actually very encouraging to hear our guests from Japan to talk about the Japanese consumer confidence remains strong. We'll see what's going to happen in the U.S. But the other thing that's very important is that for the Chinese policymakers, we still have quite a bit of toolbox, quite a few devices, and a lot of room to stimulate the economy. So I think the recovery in trade will take time, but it will come back.
Okay, we'll talk about the Chinese government's toolkit later on. Mr. Beck, do you share Mr. Chen's optimism that China's economic activities will come back to normal very soon?
I'm afraid the answer to so many of these questions is 2 words. It depends. If there's a new outbreak in a different part of China, then you'd have to have further containment and things would have to be slowed down again. But I think we need to distinguish 3 different sorts of effects. One is the direct effect of the virus on slowing down existing economic activity. The second is that you're going to see quite a lot of substitution. For example, you were asking our Japanese guest about the possibility of Chinese tourism slowing down. But what you find in many countries is that when abroad, a foreign country looks unattractive, you stay at home and go on holiday there. What's been called in the UK staycation instead of going to another country. And the third thing is that you get the changes of different sectors. Some sectors are going to do well out of this, for example, healthcare or pharmaceuticals, while others are hit. And this turmoil in the market will condition what the overall effect is. I would agree with Professor Chen that what's likely to happen is that as the weather gets warmer, the virus slows down. We have a coronavirus scare every year. We just call it flu rather than COVID-19. And the flu disappears by the spring. So I think the likelihood is that the immediate trigger will slow down. But what you then find is that if there's an overreaction by the authorities, then it may be that's causing the economic turmoil rather than the virus itself.
But you forget to mention the big factor of panic. Already people in Europe are worried about where this is going. The European countries are still battling coronavirus. Northern Italy is still in lockdown. As you said, there is a big
Yes.
unanswered question, how long it will drag on. So European economic activities are still uncertain.
Yes, but this will once again depend on whether the combination of what you're calling panic and the reaction or overreaction of the authorities will determine whether the hit to the economy is big or very moderate.
But it seems so far the Italian and the French and the German government haven't been successfully contain the virus as the Chinese did. And of course, we know Europe economy is still in trouble, especially Italian. Can anything be done to deal with this?
Well, I think you should make the connection and say that what happened in Hubei province was the best part of 2 months ago. Italy is maybe 6 weeks behind Wuhan. Other countries are yet to face the kind of crisis that will need containment. So it's evolving, and it's the nature of the reaction from different governments that will determine whether the impact is very pronounced or very little.
Professor Tian, let's come back to China. As Mr. Beck just mentioned, China probably 6 weeks ahead of elsewhere in terms of both the control of the epidemic and the economic policy rollout. But do you expect demand and consumption to come back fully in the coming month when, let's say, China contained this virus as we all wished?
So again, and as other guests pointed out, it's actually very important. The reason I remain optimistic that the other countries will eventually contain the virus is just look at how bad things were in Wuhan and Hubei a little less than 2 months ago. You know, you take these tough measures, it will slow it down. And as we've seen, economic activities are picking up. Certainly it takes time because a lot of coordination is needed for the product chain to resume work all at once. But it will come back. And so we know that the first quarter numbers will look very bad. So we now know the export numbers looks not good. Import actually is not that bad. In fact, open economy macroeconomics says when domestic demand is weak, temporarily increasing imports to have a larger trade deficit is actually one way you can stimulate total demand. I do believe that domestic demand for consumption, which is very important, remains strong. Actually,
you think so?
Said that there's a lot of substitution because, you know, a lot of the substitution just gone online.
But you have to.
I think
you
a
have
lot
to
of the
admit, for
demand
some
for
of the
consumption
businesses,
remains strong because
the demand will remain
sluggish
sluggish for quite some time.
Yes.
For example, the restaurants, travel business, leisure, tourism, and even beauty industries, which require a lot of human interactions, that will remain sluggish for quite some time. People are still afraid to go out and mingle with people.
That's sure. Sure, that's absolutely true, but as our Japanese guest pointed out, it's the same situation in China. Restaurant industry, tourism, it's very important, but they actually accounted for a very small fraction of GDP. What you'd want to see is production, manufacturing, everything related to global product chain to resume, and China can do a lot of that in a very quick but orderly fashion to resume working, to end the disruption. As I said, the encouraging thing is that if you look at in China, now the challenge is to prevent what we call imported cases of the virus, because it's been a week or 2 weeks, even in Hubei. It's very encouraging, the number of new cases. So clearly, this is a balancing act. And the Chinese government, as I said, can do a lot, both on the fiscal stimulus, also on the monetary policy. The Chinese risk-free interest rate are far from zero, so there is a lot of room to work with. But clearly, we need to be careful about these very excessive stimulus, as my colleague from LSE pointed out. Sometimes you actually don't want the policymaker to overreact. That's actually also very important.
And Mr. Beck, because China is now the #2 world economy, and also China occupied a big part of the global value chain, that means it will have its ripple effects on the rest of the value chain. Those produce other parts of certain product, Southeast Asian nations and America as well. What do you think the ripple effects of that will be?
Well, it's bound to be a downward risk. Chinese imports, you said earlier, are down 5%. If they're down 5%, that's demand in the rest of the world that's also down 5%. So that's a phenomenon that can't be contradicted. But I do want to take issue with Professor Chen on the scale of retailing and other service industries. In a typical European economy, manufacturing or industry as a whole is 20% or lower, and services match that. So when you have a slowdown in services, it can have quite a dramatic effect, particularly on employment. And you're right to instance some of these things that are being at risk. However, with that said, you do need to look at the substitution effect. If you don't go to the shop, you do buy online. And if you're buying online, you're employing a delivery driver rather than a shop worker. And that's the kind of change that's taking place as the economy adjusts to this new phenomenon. So I think there's more reason for optimism about this than is sometimes portrayed in the media.
Mr. Chen, I want you to respond to that. Do you think the unemployment issue, because of the loss of jobs in services, can be picked up by some other sectors, substitute jobs?
Yes, but let me respond to Professor Bag's point. I agree with him in that if you look at the GDP, consumption is very important. But within consumption, the contribution from people going to restaurant is a small part. And as I said, people have basically shifted that part of the consumption to online. Exactly, and you've seen this sort of market mechanism where delivery companies are now picking up people from restaurant workers. So there is substitution going on. But I agree, this is a very important issue for the Chinese government to worry about, that there is this short-term mechanism that we need to make sure that enough people can go back to their post, can go back to their job. And that, you know, if a restaurant worker cannot go back to the restaurant, we want to make sure that he or she has a suitable job at a similar industry. That's very important in the short run. But at the same time, it's also important that we've discussed this before, that for small and medium enterprises, as they resume business, if they can have a lot of flexibility on labor, it's actually very important for them to recover. Because,
and there are already debates on whether the Chinese government
for a lot of small businesses,
roll out large-scale stimulus packages like we did in 2008 because of the financial crisis. But a lot of people argue that is actually quench your thirst by drinking poison. It will have negative effects. Do you think the Chinese government is considering full-scale stimulus? Mr. Chen?
I'm sure they're considering all kinds of options. Yes, I believe they're considering all kinds of options. I actually have done some research on the impact of the 4 trillion stimulus China had in 08-09. It's very important to realize that among the 4 trillion stimulus, the majority of that was actually a credit stimulus. It's not fiscal. Credit, what I mean by credit stimulus is that large banks pumped a lot of new loans into the economy. That was the problem. That caused a lot of debt issues down the road. That caused the spike in the growth of shadow banking in China. So as we consider options on the table, monetary policies got to be considered, fiscal policies got to be considered, but it's very important for the policymaker not to overreact, and especially as soon as the economy starts to recover very quickly, they need to be very careful not to do a large-scale credit stimulus.
Mr. Beck, you think the stimulus should be monetary or fiscal policies or both?
I think there's a third dimension that matters. Yes, monetary and fiscal policy can work together to sustain or underpin aggregate demand. But there's one aspect of the virus which is very important and is very high on the agenda in European countries, which is what do you do about workers who are told to stay at home and to self-isolate and therefore cannot go to work? If their income falls as a result of that, then that's one channel of demand that is diminished. And there's much talk in European countries about easing the rules on being away from work to ensure that the workers continue to receive income and therefore are continuing to be able to spend. It's different from a macroeconomic stimulus because it operates at the individual level or the household level rather than being simply pump priming of the sort we're used to in major downturns.
But British Prime Minister Boris Johnson just said that Britain's economy is still robust and the government will give businesses support. What kind of support does he mean? And you think the UK's economy is still robust?
Yes, I think there's no immediate threat to the British economy. But if things go badly wrong with the containment of coronavirus, then things can get worse. But I emphasize that it's not just businesses, it's households, consumers who need to ensure that their income is maintained. One decision already taken in the British context is to give somebody immediate unemployment pay if they have to leave work to self-isolate as a way of containing the virus. Normally there'll be a qualifying period of a few weeks before they received any support. Now that's a sensible measure to ensure that demand is not undermined.
And Mr. Chen, we have 2 minutes left. My final question is probably about U.S. and China economic relations. Weeks ago, some in the U.S. claimed that this outbreak of coronavirus could speed up decoupling from #1 and #2 economies in the world because the Americans worry about overexposure to the Chinese. What do you think?
It's actually easier said than done. This has been a test, right? We know that some companies try to move their product chain from China to, for example, Southeast Asia. It might be a temporary fit. For the longer term, there are a lot of supportive conditions to help to ensure such a move. I actually think that the fact because China is recovering the earliest, China should be able to retain most of its status on the product chain. So decoupling is actually not that easy. A final point, even though this is very unlikely to happen, but it's worth mentioning, it will be another stimulus if the U.S. can get rid of the tariffs it imposed on China and other countries. It will be good for everyone.
All right, and this is election year in the U.S. We're running out of time. Thank you very much, Mr. Chen, and thank you, Mr. Okubu and Mr. Beck, for your analysis and insights. And you've been watching Dialogue here on CGTN. I'm Joe in Beijing. Goodbye.